All right, so greetings to Oakland. My name is Can Buyukberber. I'm here today with my professor, Mr. Jeremy Morgan. I'm hoping you're enjoying the first edition of the Festival of Immersive Arts. This has been a long time coming, and now I'm very excited that you are seeing all the pieces. Hopefully, you enjoyed the Metaxy installation. And today we're gonna have artist conversation with my professor, Mr. Jeremy Morgan, who I met during my master's studies in San Francisco Art Institute. We had a wonderful time over there. Before going into our conversation, I want to briefly intro us. So my name is Can Buyukberber. I'm a visual artist working on immersive audiovisual experiences, focusing on the interaction between physical and digital spaces. My practice usually consists of experiments with different media such as virtual augmented reality, projection mapping, geodesic domes, large-scale displays, and digital fabrication. I have a background in physics and visual communication design, and after receiving a Fulbright scholarship, I started my master's degree in SFAI with an emphasis in art and technology. And I also had great experiences in the Bay Area, such as the artist residencies in Autodesk Pier 9 residency and Adobe's augmented reality artist residency. And I exhibited these type of works around the world. And Mr. Jeremy Morgan, he was born in 1956 in Cambridge, England. He was educated at the Ruskin School of Drawing, University of Oxford between 1974 and 77, the Royal Academy Schools, London, 1979 to 82, and at my school, 30 years ago, the San Francisco Art Institute between 1983 and 85, and he became a fellow he became a Harkness Fellow between 83 and 85. He's an associate professor of painting at San Francisco Art Institute, where he has taught since 1989 in both undergraduate and graduate programs. He also taught at JFK University Arts and Consciousness Program, graduate program, CCA in Oakland, California, and given various workshops in China, Beijing. He's also affiliated with Lucid Arts Foundation in California, and he has exhibited in the USA, UK, China. In his own words, Mr. Morgan describes his work, quote, "My work as a painter is an exploration of filio-spiritual aspects of landscape and nature based in painting, referring in particular to Asian and Western traditions in relation to concepts of the abstract. This work is augmented by an increasing interest in the use of technological processes as means by which, allied with painting, one might reveal that which lays beyond appearance alone." So, dear sir, welcome. It's great to have you here. It's a great honor to speak with you and have this conversation on record. It's been a while.
Yes, a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you. First, I want to mention how we met. We met exactly 5 years ago during an exhibition in SFAI at the Diego Rivera Gallery, where I presented you a piece called Morphogenesis, which was a VR experience. And after experiencing that, and I'm not sure if that was your first VR experience or not.
It was indeed my first time. Yes, very memorable. Yes.
Amazing. And I remember all the wonderful feedback you gave me, and I was so amazed because in different ways we're exploring a similar philosophy, a similar artistic territory, and you were kind enough to have that feedback on record. And that's a very precious recording for me. And so I want to start there. Like, what did you feel when we first met and experienced your first VR experience?
Well, for me, it was very exciting because it was a term only to me, not any sense of reality. So when you gave me the equipment, the headpiece, and I put it on, as a painter, as a live sentient being, it was an extraordinarily exciting experience to be thrown into this world which was essentially playing with my sense of perception. I understood I was having some kind of particular engagement, but what I found intriguing was often art is predicated, depending on the nature of the art, on some spectatorial distance between where we are and where the art occurs. Maybe music bypasses that because it's immersive by nature. And painting, drawing, sculpture have various degrees of interaction, which can be intimate or based on distance. But in this instance, the idea of being within a space, which was animate, and my own physical response to that was to realize that I had a limited control in the most interesting way. The person, the creator, in your case, you, who created the movements for me, gave me another sense of how I could operate in relationship to the moving world. And motion, as part of my interest as an artist through landscape, motion and energy are key elements of my work. And for me, your work gave me a very interesting and exciting set of things to think about in terms of how I might then approach painting.
Wow, thank you so much. Vocabulary of describing these internal landscapes is so rich, and how you relate to that into human perception and understanding of the space. That's a feedback that an artist like me, who is mostly described as a tech artist, or like who is working with these new technologies and stuff. Usually that technological part is so upfront with these shows. It's sometimes hard for people to really relate to your work and what you're really trying to convey through the use of this media. And you are one of the first people who really captured that, and I appreciate that so much. So how do you see similarities in terms of these internal landscapes?
The world, I think essentially the aspect of that connects your work and mine, just using us as two examples, and as you say, I feel very a kinship with you in terms of your vision. I think there's a synthesis between the ways we think and the different ways we operate, but there is this idea of sensation, and sensation is the key word, I think, in terms of how we apprehend or comprehend the notion of an experience, the very nature of how we perceive what it is we're experiencing. And so for me, what you're doing is pushing further that idea. As I've often thought myself, what would it be like to wander through a painting? Well, there are various forms and experiments that have been done by artists, and I'm not one of those yet, but I'm beginning to think about the possibilities. But partly for me, the beauty of what you're doing is the technological is only another form of technology, which painting was one of the first parts of technology.
Exactly.
Was making marks. This is a modern incarnation. For me, your work and the work of the digital, when it's done imaginatively, touches on the very nature of where consciousness and physicality form a relationship, pure and simple. And, there we live by a series of responses to stimulus through our senses to the world we live in. Then the function of our mind is to, through our imagination, to begin to interpret and comprehend what it is we're experiencing. And artists are essentially, I think, involved in research just as much as scientists. You are both a scientist and an artist. You are a scientist and a poet, in my mind, and a philosopher. And, most digital artists are, in my opinion. Of course, there are mechanisms which can be created to produce certain effects, but I think you are a true pioneer in the sense that the way you seem to approach things is with a very carefully developed aesthetic, which comes back to your own fundamental excitement about the nature of being, consciousness, and art making. And for me, art making is a process of archiving consciousness, whether it's pen on paper, paint on canvas, or the digital spectacular technology that you deal with. They all come down to a brain, an eye, and a body responding to stimulation in certain ways and beginning to understand physically how we actually see, which is a very complex process. And it's too involved to get into now, but I'm sure you're involved in this too. I am. But fundamentally, I'd like to think the idea, not to get too off point, but part of my own interest is the idea that painting and all forms of visual contact arguably are primarily based on the history of architecture in relationship to images. We see fundamentally through this mechanism, a circle. It's not until we started creating art that was made after the building of architecture, which required we went in and out of buildings And the in and out of buildings meant portals or doorways, which became format, which is the thing we're using now. And the formatting is what both provided us the aperture or the window or the portal, but also separated us from that which we were conveying. And so what you're involved with, and certain painters involved with it too, abstractly, is taking the edge and challenging its authority. And what you do with your immersive work is throw us into a space where there is no spectatorial distance. There's an implied and actual intimacy that I think is profoundly important.
Wow. Wow. That's so inspiring to hear these words from you. And like, it's so mind opening for me. You know, you're so fluent with creating all these historical connections, scientific connections, artistic connections, but it's so fascinating. And that makes me really curious about, you know, your evolution as an artist. And I'm also particularly curious about, you did the MFA program in San Francisco Art Institute in the 80s, and I did the same program, the same MFA program in the 2010s, after 30 years. So, you know, in relationship to your artistic evolution, I'm also curious about how do you see the differences and similarities between these eras?
I think there's a good question. It's not an easy one to answer, but I think I'm going to use an example of Kandinsky's notion of the ascending triangle. And to give a moment in time, there's a timeline. Let's go the beginning of the 20th century. And we take an arrow and we put world culture within that arrow as a structure, all the knowledge of the world to that point. And that is ascending through time. And in amongst those areas will be Einstein's theory of relativity, going back to the Greeks or to China, great philosophers at the time, coming up with concepts which were then new. As the triangle ascends, that new information becomes passed out into the wider universe and community. And so what we have at the Art Institute and any great institution is this idea of an evolving evolution of possibilities, which has a core connecting element, which also has the capacity to be imaginative, to add layers of new implications and meanings to it. So you have, you know, filmmaking becomes digital filmmaking, video, sculpture becomes installation, etc. Painting becomes multiple forms of painting. And so, you know, when I saw you coming through the program, I saw another generation, and I saw somebody who, to me, with all of your technology, you still had fundamentally an aesthetic relationship to the world. You're an aesthetic researcher, and you know that means you contain within you informational structures which you use to utilize in order to qualify the nature of an experience, to bring it into the presence of people's experience. And that's what artists do. I think they take various things which are of interest to them, they find a way of putting it together, which then becomes communicable. And I think that when I look at the idea of people, and as I've done over many years of teaching, it's not about newness, it's about meaningfulness and relevance. So you can still make a painting and that can be relevant. But if it's not relevant for you, then you need to find another way. So technology might be that way. For me, it's not a battle, it's an ongoing evolution. Excuse me, there's always room for drawing, painting, printmaking. But then what can printmaking become? What can sculpture become? What can painting become? And the digital is providing, for those that have the wisdom to understand it, I'm not threatened by technology. I embrace it with some awe, but I also know my limitations and my abilities, but nothing will replace for me the idea of how I make a painting. But that being said, I've adopted digital processes because I'm beginning to use materials, different types of paint, then I digitally print them, then I expand them, print them onto transparent surfaces, restretch them and paint back into them. So I'm doing what I'm calling fainting, P-H-I-N-T-I-N. And those things to me are very interesting because they're a recognition of what is both a continuum but an evolution at the same time. And I wish people would be less worried about whether it's new, contemporary, or otherwise. Make it meaningful and exciting, and you'll hold new audience, you know. But too many people are trying to think too quickly, how can I make something new, without understanding why they might be doing that. But you were doing something new because your technological abilities, plus your poetic soul, if I can call it that, became fused, enabled you to do things that science alone would not allow you to achieve. And so science and art at their highest end meet in the world of the mysterious, the enigmatic, the powerfully attractive, and the forever intriguing. and then enigmatic. And, great religions, great philosophies, great art, great science all point to those extreme forms of experience.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, I mean, we are all products of our own time, I guess.
Yes.
I mean, when I was a kid, I was drawing. I was making little maquettes, but
Right.
after that, I I have my personal computer, and I started to learn about video editing and 3D animation, and I was a big sci-fi fan, and that was a very important era in terms of the digitization of the moving
Yeah.
arts and animation. So all those things, watching like visual effects documentaries when I was in high school was as natural to someone else as reading Tom Sawyer when they're a kid.
Yes.
So that was my childhood, and this technologies and this new language is such a natural way of expressing myself. So and I'm really amazed, and I respect your point of view so much that you are also directly seeing what is really the essence inside that communication, and not lose our focus with these devices and fetishizing the technology, which I
Yes.
think yeah, please go ahead.
No, I think it's a very important point, because I think there's the art world, and then there's artists in the world. And the art world has its strengths and weaknesses, and you can talk about capitalism and, all of the nonsense of the art world at one end. But what makes people make art is a fundamental. It's been going on for a long time for a reason. How we all survive making this stuff, and how we promulgate the work, and how we get out, there's issues we have to deal with. But the fact that, I used to say to the students at the Art Institute, I would love to give them a T-shirt as they go through commencement. And the T-shirt would say, I am a fine artist, seemingly practically useless, but actually fundamentally vital. And that's really how I feel about it. Because too much emphasis in arts education has been on the idea of the material. And great education is about the expansion of consciousness, end of. It's not rocket science. It's actually much more complex.
Exactly.
But it's about the expansion
exactly.
of the expansion of consciousness, and the idea of volition and sentience in relationship, how you want to engage in the world. And so the where's me and means me wherefores is another issue. But that I am going to be an artist. I then work out how I will support that habit, whether it's practical or impractical. But that the art comes first. And if you want to teach, then it's wonderful, because I've always found teaching to be so incredibly rewarding. And it's like a biofeedback or symbiotic relationship. Talking to you inspires me when I go to my studio. Talking to my other students, thinking through their problems and seeing how they solve them, becomes ways which I can re-understand the world. So it's very, very vital to me.
Same,
but the most important
same here, sir.
Yeah, it just, to me, it's so beautiful. And I think that, that philosophy, art, and certain parts of science should be fully funded ventures. Art and music should be primary in every school, from kindergarten through high school. Because what people won't accept or understand is we live in a world where everything is measured now into a material outcome. And people talk about investment. There's psychic investment. An art is psychic investment. Good education is psychic investment in your community. And an awareness and a criticality of thinking, and a desire and a passion that has to be awakened. Otherwise, we create clones. And, artists are always capable of causing uncertainty and disquiet, because they challenge the norm. If they do it with sentience and caringly, not just because it could be done that way, but really think about things, it's very valuable. And it's, philosophy and I think it was on the gravestone, Lee Krasner, painting and poetry may not save the world, but without it, what is there to save? And I really believe that.
I believe that too. So this brings us to our last 10 minutes, and I'm gonna. This topic also brings us well to the Oakland Festival of the Immersive Arts, and I want to have your perspective on the piece that I'm exhibiting over there, Metaxy. I want to briefly read the description of the piece. And I'm very excited to hear your thoughts, because you're literally the first person who saw it, And I hopefully you can see it when you're back in the Bay Area.
Yeah,
Hopefully
yeah, I
we
will make sure.
exhibited it again, and you can see it in person.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
so my piece for this festival is called Metaxy. This is a volumetric audiovisual installation, and I imagined this piece, and I'm aiming it to function as some sort of a technological time capsule with that feeling when you walk inside the space. I tried to create a feeling of you are witnessing this holographic stream of consciousness from a distant future with that you found in that gallery space, and it shows you and reminds you of a vital era, a crucial era of our planet, with these anthropocenic imagery that the piece projects into the space. Through the use of fog, I tried to create this volumetric imagery, and one of my intentions with this piece was also to focus on the human impact on the environment and the byproduct side effects of the of our society, and with temperature increase and solar activity increase, we see sea level rises, wildfires, and all around the world, and we're going to be witnessing other unforeseeable consequences of that. But I try to use a very abstract language and very experiential, immersive language. And Mr. Morgan, I'm very excited to hear your first thoughts as the first viewer of the piece.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a big responsibility. I should try my best. I've seen it 3 times now, and there are many things that came to mind. And amongst the first was the idea, in general sense, the role of symmetry. And in terms of your work, this idea of how an image becomes manifest. We discussed prior to our interview about aspects of your work where my understanding is that when the installation is experienced, it will be in an environment which is hazed or fogged. And part of that idea, to me, I think is absolutely fantastic, because even without that, as I saw it on the screen on my phone, I was already engaged. And I was engaged for a number of reasons. One, that it's black and white. And for me, most people, if they're lucky, have color in their sight. So when you see black and white images, often black and white photographs to me are more compelling than chromatic ones, for the same reason. There's a sense of the familiar and the unfamiliar. So what you created for me was somewhere between a religio-philosophical, socio-economic, political manifesto or conveyance of the idea of the state of humanity to this point. So you start off with something where you have the idea of the figures, of a figural presence, and then the eye becomes important, because that's how we see the world with the function of the brain behind it. But then, was I looking at the viewer, or am I the viewer? And after a while, I didn't want to worry about that. I just was excited by the idea that the figural gave way to the more abstract. And you took us on a journey, and part of that journey at some point includes a shift in energy and rhythms. And the pulsation, the music, by the way, was fantastic. I don't know who was responsible for that, but that's you, or you work with artists, but they did a great job of synthesizing between the sound and the visual experience. The audio visual was incredible. But for me, I felt, without it being in any sense preachy, it was a kind of overview. Once I began to realize, I saw buildings appear and what we call landscapes in historical sense, I thought, okay, now we're looking at the edifices of humanity, power structures, buildings, industry. And then there was a melting away of that into the realm of pure energy, when the raw energy of the universe was clearly more present and all-powerful, far greater than the hubris of humanity in terms of their buildings. And I like that. Excuse me. It wasn't a declamation, but it was making a statement about this idea of what we take off as symbols of power, authority. And architecture is an example of how humans have, with good sense or bad sense, interrelated to the spaces they occupy. But in the case of this, you're using it as a symbol for power, industry. And with that, we have the realization that ancient cultures relied on a harmonic relationship to the universe, and the industrial contemporary ones have relied on the idea of what can be consumed rather than what can be lived with. So to me, I felt there was an ancient spirit in there, because within it is a plea for sanity. You didn't have answers, but I think you had questions about what have we achieved and what haven't we achieved, and how can we go forward without total destruction being the ultimate result. The ultimate reality is, as COVID has expressed to us, nature doesn't really care about us one way or the other. It's simply an incredible environment in which we're born and with which we live, and we should pay greater attention to. There's the lesson. But itself, we can anthropomorphize it, we can spiritualize it, but nature has no interest in us. Nature does its thing. And we are custodians of the planet, and we've done a mighty bad job of it thus far, from probably the beginning of the 19th century, definitely through to now, before then too, I think. But what I felt was beautiful was this idea, visually, you took us through a series of images, and I would recommend people, if time allows, to watch it 2 or 3 times, because my only concern would be this idea of where it began and where it ends. And what I like with your work is this idea that there is not necessarily a beginning or an end.
Yeah.
Looking at your piece reminded me of some aspects of other cultures like kairos and chronos in Greek, which is clearly an interest to you. This idea of how time is actually understood. And then there's the idea of time and space. And then there's the idea of duration. And you get into realms of philosophers and others to think about this idea of what the nature of experience is. But the piece has a beauty because I think the aesthetic holds our attention and we begin to care, I think, but also we shift between being spectator and realizing we are participant. We are all partly responsible for what we're seeing there, one way or another, by virtue of our habits, what we do when we drive a car, how we regard recycling, right the way down to how we understand what nature is. And for me, the process of art has been a constant for many people. Nature was the source of art, and I think it still is for most people. But now we live in a much more multi-layered world. And what I found also fascinating with your work, that was the black and white. When Guernica was painted by Picasso, in part, he did it to suggest the idea of a journal or newspaper. And it's an extension of the aesthetic of Cubism, which was to take color out of it for a while, to bring it back to base perception. And so what you're doing is you actually romanticizing something while you also make it very stark. And I think that's a powerful element of the work.
Wow. I can't thank you enough for all these priceless insights and feedback. I mean, it makes me so happy to hear from you, and also all the things you mentioned. It shows me the power of new media and this new kind of art forms, that all these messages and all this communication was conveyed to you through this piece of moving images and sounds. It's so priceless to me to have that feedback. And unfortunately, this brings us to our last minute, Jeremy, and I want to thank you so much for your time. You've been very generous with it. And I want to thank also to our viewers today who are present, and thank you very much for experiencing the piece. And I want to thank Festival of Immersive Arts and the committee in Oakland, and thank you for organizing this festival and also exhibiting my work over there. And I'm looking forward to meet Jeremy and all the fellows over there in the Bay Area again, and see the piece in person. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.